Hi, and welcome to a very special edition of Nostalgia Alley. We have a man I've wanted to have on the show for a very, very long time. His name is Howard Lipstein, and Howard lives a double life. During the day, he's a very prominent attorney here in New Jersey, and at night, he's a clarinetist and a musicologist. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Great to have you on.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
What I wanted to ask you, the big question, where did jazz originate?
Well, there's a lot of different theories about it, but what I believe, it really came from the Deep South, the Delta region. I believe that what happened was when the slaves were working as a way of offsetting the hard labor and everything that they were doing, they developed what ultimately became the blues. And the blues was very much the basis for jazz. It's a 12-bar form of music. And it permeated music right up until today, the blues form of music. And it went from that area, and then musicians who played horns started, playing it musically, not just singing the blues, in New Orleans. Which included, Louis Armstrong and Kid Ory and the famous New Orleans jazz musicians. And then from New Orleans, it went up the Mississippi and wound up, Louis wound up in Chicago in the early 1920s. He had a great band, which is a very, very interesting story because the fella that booked him in Chicago, his name was Joe Glazer. And Joe Glazer put up a sign on top of the marquee for this was essentially a bar that Louis Armstrong, the greatest trumpet player in the world. Mm. And he was a great promoter, Joe Glazer. And he ultimately founded a booking agency called ABC Booking, who in the 1940s booked Ella Fitzgerald,
wow,
Louis, wow, many of the big bands, and he was really, really outstanding. But it started in the Deep South, and it came out of, I really believe, the hard work, the blues. It was an expression of what was happening, and then it developed musically.
Are there different styles of jazz? I mean,
there are many different styles of jazz. I mean, in those days, jazz was ultimately came to be called Dixieland jazz. And then in the early 30s, they started what they call swing bands, but they weren't bands ultimately like the Benny Goodman Organization or anything like that. They were much smaller. They were like 10, 11, 9 pieces, maybe 12, 13 would be a lot. And ultimately in the 40s, they had the standard instrumentation, which was like 5 saxes, 4 or 5 trombones, 4 or 5 trumpets, and a rhythm section which included drums, piano, bass, and guitar. And that became what was the height of the swing era. That was the organization, but they were much smaller when they started. They were much smaller.
Now, what started your interest in jazz? Did it start as a child? Or?
Yeah, I was very lucky. I had an uncle who, from Elizabeth, New Jersey, who used to come over Sunday mornings and have coffee with my parents. And he used to tell stories about when he was in the Army, he played with the Herbie Fields Band. Herbie was from Elizabeth also. Mm. And when my uncle went down to Fort Dix, he saw Herbie, and Herbie said, "What are you doing, Jack?" And Jack said, "Well, I don't know, whatever they tell me." He says, "Listen, come with me, I'm starting a band." This band had some of the finest New York musicians from the big bands come through Fort Dix. That's where they went. They basically went from New York to Fort Dix. And my uncle every night sat next to some of the really, really great musicians. And he used to tell these stories, how wonderful it was. In fact, they also had a comedian. His name was Ernie Kovacs. I don't know if you remember.
I know Ernie. He had a wonderful show, the Ernie Kovacs show on Channel 7.
Ernie Kovacs was the comedian with the band.
Really?
And they did entertainment for the armed services. But they were stationed and they stayed at Fort Dix. But what happens when they got done at night, they used to go up to Harlem. They used to leave. Fort Dix was a heck of a trip, right?
It is.
And they went to Harlem, and they used to. But Herbie Fields was a wonderful, wonderful musician out of Elizabeth, New Jersey.
Wow.
And he played with all the greats. He really did. And my uncle was fortunate enough. He used to tell these stories, And somehow I just, was sort of enthralled by it. So my uncle played saxophone and clarinet. So when I was in 4th grade and they come around and say, does anybody want to take instrumental music? I raised my hand, and what do you want to play? I said, clarinet. And that's how it got started.
It was love at first sight between you and the clarinet,
yeah,
right?
Absolutely, it really was. But it was all because of these stories that my uncle would tell. And it was very nice. It really was a very nice thing.
Now in jazz or in general, who inspires you the most?
Well, it's hard to say who inspires you the most because there's so many great musicians, okay? But I remember the first time I heard Charlie Parker, and I could not believe what was happening. I couldn't believe how great he was. I was about 12 or 13 years old. And my father got the old Esquire magazine, and there was a story about Charlie Parker. He had just died, okay? And I think he was 34 years old when he died.
34,
yeah,
so
34
young.
years old. And the story was about how great he was as a musician, but it really explained how he died in the sense that he had a really serious drug problem. He was a serious heroin addict. It controlled his life. And but it said about what he did and who he played with, and I never heard of Charlie Parker. And then who was this guy, Charlie Parker?
Tell us a little bit about people who were young and too young to remember. What instrument did he play?
He played alto sax.
Alto sax.
And he also played tenor, but very rarely. But generally played alto sax. And he was one of the originators of the style called bebop.
Oh yes.
And bebop originated really behind the scenes in the early 1940s. What would happen is when the musicians got done playing their regular gig, they would go up to a place called Minton's. It's like, I think it's like 138th Street. It's in Harlem, okay? And they would get together like 12, 1 o'clock in the morning, and they would jam till like 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning. And they would play this sort of new type of music, which ultimately was known as bebop. And really what they were doing, okay, was they were taking tunes like All the Things You Are, which is a tremendous standard.
Standard,
okay?
yeah.
And all these other standards, and they were writing new melodies, but using essentially the same harmonics, the same chord changes. And they worked out, it was Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk, Kenny Clark, and a whole bunch of other guys too, okay? They're not quite as well known. But they were experimenting, and they essentially came up with this new style called bebop. And it caught on in the 1940s. It took a while to catch on. It was strictly New York. It wasn't any place but in New York.
That New York style.
The New York style,
New York style.
But the musicians would hear it, and it was different, but it was great. But Charlie Parker, it was one of my absolutely favorite musicians. Because this guy did something. When I hear Charlie Parker, like you're listening to the best. He was inventive. He was great. He was absolutely great. And today, he's still great. And, I mean, he's so great that there's a show in New York City on KCR, which is Columbia University Radio, that Phil Schaap has. Every morning in New York, you can hear Charlie Parker from 8:20 to 9:30 in the morning. It's called Bird Flight. Charlie Parker's nickname was Bird, Yardbird Bird. And one of the most famous tunes that he did was a tune called Ornithology, the study of birds.
My wife loves birds.
Yeah, but this is bird musically.
Yeah.
Okay, so he's in New York. You can hear him just about every single morning during the week on this show called Bird Flight. So he died in 1955, I believe. So, how many years has it been already? It's been,
long.
60?
Yeah,
70? They're still playing Charlie Parker.
That's fantastic.
It is fantastic. And Charlie Parker was just wonderful. Just wonderful. He was just great,
Wow.
So I love Charlie Parker. I love Lester Young. Lester Young was a little different than Charlie Parker.
In what way?
Well, he came up through the Basie Band when the Basie Band was in Kansas City. And when he came up, he was like one of the first of what they call the cool style, like the layback, and because a lot of guys in those days were playing very hard. They blow hard, they play loud, but Lester Young was just like laying back there doing his thing, and he was out of this world. He was with Count Basie in the late 30s. But he did some recordings around 1938 with Billie Holiday.
Oh, the great Billie Holiday.
Yeah, great is right. And Teddy Wilson,
great.
It was under his name. He led the band. But John Hammond was a producer, okay? And he came from the Vanderbilt family. His family there were Vanderbilts. And he picked up on jazz because some of the people that worked for the family, some of the black people who worked for the family, okay, they used to hang out in the basement of their townhouse in New York City. And he would go down there and he would hear them, listening to this music he never heard before. And he really picked up on it. And he promoted Billie Holiday. He found Billie Holiday.
He found Billie Holiday.
That's
a great accomplishment.
And he promoted her, all right? But there was a recording made in 1938 by Teddy Wilson, and it was all the musicians were jazz musicians, and Billie Holiday was the singer, and it's some of the finest jazz you will ever have a chance to hear. It was absolutely great. And then they did it again like a year or so later, and they said Billie Holiday in her orchestra, but they were the same. But Lester Young was on that date, and the way Lester Young played behind Billie Holiday, some say that it was like they made love musically. They just melded. She would sing and he would play obligato behind her, and it's so beautiful. It's really one of the most wonderful things that you can hear musically. And you don't have to be a jazz musician to like it, okay? It's just one of the greats. And Billie was out of this world. She was so great, really.
And all of these people are popular today, which is great
Billie Holiday is more popular today than she was when she was alive. And she died young. All these
tragic
people died.
with drugs and
she had really hard time, hard life. I mean, her life, they've made movies out of it, and there was a book that she, co-wrote, but, they say it wasn't exactly accurate. But no matter how you slice it, Billie Holiday had a hard life by anybody's measure. She just had a rough time. And then, she got involved with the drugs, and the feds were always after her. And in New York, she couldn't get a cabaret card. In order to play in New York, to play at a club, you had to have a cabaret card. But because she was a convicted felon, they wouldn't give her a cabaret card.
So what did she do when she didn't have a cabaret?
Well, she would work out of New York,
right.
But New York was the Mecca.
Wow.
But she would do concerts and things like that where it wasn't at a club, But Billie Holiday was as I say, today she's more popular than she was then, but she was out of this world, and she still is. She is still out of this world. So, these are some of my favorites. And I could go on and on.
I love you to go on.
Because, it's just the way it is. But, it just, I don't know, these people were very special. And, and what was going on was very special. Because among musicians, the music's so important that all the other things that the general public thinks is important, they put aside for the music. And when they look at somebody and they hear somebody, it's like, what are they doing musically?
All right, we're going to have a treat. You're going to play for us on the second half.
Yes,
talk about grace.
Yeah, well,
I always refer to you as the reincarnation of Benny Goodman.
Well, not quite, but
so anyway, we're going to break for a public service announcement. Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back.
Every child needs a place.
A place to call home.
A place where they can play and dream. And dream.
And plan for their future.
In the Habitat house,
my daddy helped build.
I study. I grow.
I learn.
I live. Your support can help
put a decent roof
over the heads of a family like mine.
Like mine. Like mine.
Like mine.
To learn how you can help, visit habitat.org.
Welcome back to Nostalgia Alley. We are talking nostalgia today with Howard Lipstein, who is a musicologist, clarinet player, one of the greats. And before you start, there's a loss today. There's a big loss. We don't have the big band sound today. Why don't we have it? And if we did have it, would it be as popular as it was back then?
Well, one of the reasons why you don't have it, first of all, the big bands were very popular in the 1940s, and they had ballrooms, and people would go out and they would dance, and that was their entertainment. Well, when television came in around 1950, people started staying home and watching television, and the big band business, like it seemed like in 1 year, went from a very good business for musicians and promoters and agents to like almost next to nothing. Really, and people just really didn't leave their houses, and the economics of it aren't good because a big band essentially is like 18 musicians and maybe a singer. All right, to get 18, 19 people you have to pay.
Yeah,
you know, it's hard to do. I mean, just think about Broadway when they use, you know, they don't have full pit bands anymore. They use all kinds of, you know, piped-in music and pre-recorded music, whatever it might be. So the economics of it changed, and people's style changed, and you know what they liked. And in the 50s was really 1950 or so. You know, Bill Haley in the comments, rock and roll. Rock and roll came in. Elvis Presley. You know, in the 60s, the Beatles, and you know, tastes change, and they always will change. But notwithstanding that, you've always had big bands.
Thank God.
Thank God, because musicians love big bands because they love to play with other musicians. They love the sound you can get, like a whole sax section or a trumpet section or a rhythm section, you know, and still solo within that format. And there are a lot of big bands around, but it's really done because musicians love them. They don't make money. They really don't make money. It's really hard, almost impossible, to book a big band. I mean, some of the names from years ago, Count Basie,
the best.
You know, Tommy Dorsey, they used the name Glenn Miller. Glenn Miller Band, I think, is still going.
Still around. We saw them recently here at SOPAC.
Yeah, and they're good. I mean, these guys are very good, but the music, you know, doesn't appeal to the younger people, you know, and it hasn't for a long time. And other forms of music, or other styles of music have become popular, which is fine. Because that's how jazz became popular too. It replaced other styles of music.
Well, talking about big bands, would you do a couple of selections for us?
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to.
It'd be great.
All right. This is a tune that Benny Goodman did. It's called Memories of You. It was written by U.B. Blake.
U.B. Blake.
Who was a great, great, great piano player. And I'd like to do that. tune that
terrific.
Goodman did with the trio. It was Teddy Wilson on piano and Gene Krupa
Wow.
on drums. And you talk about
Can't
great
beat that.
musicians. You can't leave out Gene Krupa. He was out of
I
this
love
world.
Gene. I saw him at the Intrapol on Broadway years and years ago, and he was just incredible.
I think the place was named Metropole.
Metropole, that's
and
right,
it was on
Metropole.
7th Avenue,
Right.
on 48th Street.
That's right.
And I went to NYU, and they had a campus up in the Heights in the Bronx. But when I come home on weekends, or I would go downtown, I heard Gene Krupa, and he was not only a great drummer, but it's the way he presented himself. He was truly a gentleman. He was just great to watch and play.
It's a thrill to see that,
It was a thrill to see. I loved seeing Gene Krupa.
And you just did the U.B. Blake piece. He worked up until his 90s, didn't he,
I
U.B.
think
Blake?
he did. He played. Yeah, he played.
I think he lived to be
like-
98 or something. He lived a long
Yeah, he lived,
life.
He lived
I mean,
well into his
wow.
90s. Yeah, he was very good. In fact, there was, I think, a Broadway show, U.B.,
U.B., right.
which was based on his life.
And Gene's, the other guy he wrote with Sissel and I may be wrong on that, but he was great. Do you have another selection for us?
Yeah, sure.
Well,
no
yeah,
problem.
absolutely.
Okay, this is called Honeysuckle Rose. This was written by Fats Waller.
The great Fats Waller.
The great Fats Waller.
Yeah.
Right?
All right, terrific.
Yeah, it's a great tune. It really is.
Let me ask you a crazy question.
Yeah.
As a lawyer, do you find similarities between the law and jazz?
No. Okay. Give you a blunt answer. Jazz is freewheeling.
Mm.
There is one aspect of law and jazz. When you play jazz, you're improvising. You're making it up as you go along. You take a chorus, you hear in your mind, or you may know the chords, but you just play what you feel, and you're literally making music on the spot. You're composing music. Now, the only thing that's similar in law is that if you're like summing up to a jury or summing up to a judge, you have to be creative. You have to improvise.
Oh, absolutely.
You have to use everything you have to convince whoever you're talking to
Exactly.
that your position is the correct one, is the right one. The judge should find for your client. And that's the only similarity
Well,
I
it's
can
there.
really think of. And there are some very talented lawyers who do that very, very well. And they're very appealing because they do it so well.
Well, you're very appealing as a musician.
Well, thank you. But I see that as a similarity. And, lawyers also get to meet a lot of people from different walks of life. And you learn to understand that you get a very wide range of experiences. And as a jazz musician, it's really the same thing.
Now, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but who would you consider the best male vocalist of all time? I mean, there are so many.
There are so many. For me, it's Frank Sinatra.
I would go along with that.
I think Frank Sinatra, in fact, there's a XM radio station. It's called Seriously Sinatra.
Oh, wow.
And and I listen to it all the time because I love Frank Sinatra. It's like about every third tune is a Frank Sinatra
He's
tune.
like a storyteller with music.
You know what it is with Frank Sinatra? You really get the feeling he lived it.
Yes.
And when he does a ballad or what he calls a saloon tune, saloon song, and he had great taste, and he had great musicians, always, surrounded by great musicians, great arrangers, Nelson Riddle.
Oh, my God.
I mean, you can just go on and on. These people were like the best, the cream of the crop. So he always had the best with him, But
now we have like 1 minute to go. Best female vocalist, who would you say?
Well, for me, it's Billie Holiday.
I would say so.
She just, for me, every time I hear her, it's an emotional experience.
Great. No, we have 1 minute. Would you play us off?
Want me to play off?
So this is Mike Sobel saying goodnight to you, and especially to you. And Howard, play us off.
All right. No problem. I'm just going to play some blues.
All right.
Actually by Herbie Fields, called No Word Blues.
I love it.
Okay.